Hello! So I recently ran a community poll to decide what Happy Tree Friends video I should make. Of the 4 options, the overwhelming winner, with over 50% of the votes, ended up being a look into the Happy Tree Friends storyboards. I talked about these in brief moments in my iceberg video, and it seemed that people really liked them, so I am more than happy to talk about the subject in depth. Learning about the process of animation is something that's always interested me, and thankfully this show has lots of public behind-the-scenes material, leaving a lot to study and look into. In fact, there's so much that I'm gonna have to split this into 2 videos. So, I am proud to present Part 1 of a look into the world of Happy Tree Friends storyboards. First things first, we should go over the basics. If you don't know what a storyboard is, they're a type of graphic organizer used in visual mediums to give a basic outline of what a scene should look like. They generally use fairly simple sketches with labels and notes to convey the intended motions, gestures, camera positions, general shot composition, facial expressions. It's basically just the script turned into a very descriptive comic made to communicate what the writers want to the animators. These are often a very interesting way to see how a show is developed, and luckily, Happy Tree Friends has released the storyboards for a large portion of episodes, mainly through the many DVD releases as a bonus feature. One reason these boards are so interesting to look through is the fact that the show has always been animated in Flash, or Adobe Animate as it's now called, using rigs for the characters instead of drawing them frame by frame. Because of this, the characters always look basically identical between episodes, as they always use the same assets. This allows the storyboard artist to use whatever art style they want, as unlike a traditionally animated show, the exact proportions and style of the boards don't impact the final product. So while the boards for other shows usually just look like rougher versions of the final animation, these boards have a lot of unique charm to them, and thus there's more to talk about. So let's start by taking a look at the early seasons of the show first, and then we'll go from there. Almost every episode before the TV series has public storyboards released on the DVD releases, and they're formatted in a way so that the animation is side by side with the boards, so comparing them is quite easy. What isn't easy, however, is finding out who actually made the boards for the early episodes. The show in its early years definitely took a lot of design cues from co-creator Rody Montijo, as you can see by comparing the final animation to the character designs that he made. It wasn't until the TV season that episodes specifically credited the storyboard artist, so I'm just gonna have to go off of the boards themselves and try and guess who made them. One thing that helped with this is the fact that co-creator Ken Navarro almost always uses this sort of magenta color for his artwork on the show, specifically the Colorace Carmine Red colored pencil. Knowing this, we can assume these early boards were done by Ken, as they use this exact color. Also, it's mentioned on the commentary track that Ken drew Handy's scowl, so it's very likely that he did draw all the boards in this color, basing them off of Rody's concept art. Regardless, there are plenty of interesting things that I noticed while looking through these, so let's look at some of those. Right off the bat, we can see that the boards are often much rougher than the final animation, as they weren't drawn with the expectation of ever being released to the public. A good example is in Helping Helps, which has this tree with a very helpful label on it. I guess Ken just wasn't confident that this looked like a tree. Crazy Antics shows an early, much more realistic design for the ants, as well as the start of a common trend you'll see in many boards featuring Sniffles. That being Sniffles' mouth being put on his face, implying that his nose is a second mouth with a tongue. It makes Sniffles look less like an anteater and more like an elephant, and while I admit I kinda like this look better, it makes sense why the show never used this design. Well, besides Take a Hike, but that was an animation error.
Sniffles' mouth, by the way, if you notice, there's off.
Yeah, he got it underneath his snout.
That was an art thing we didn't catch until, well, you later.
Until right now.
What Are You Waiting For, if you're asking me, is actually funnier in the boards than it is in the final animation. The final only has one sign to show no swimming, but the boards have this gag where there's a separate sign for every creature, and the camera pans over to show each one as it attacks Cuddles. I don't really know why this was cut though, as it seems very in line with the show's sense of humor, and it's not like it would have been that hard to do. My best guess is that they just wanted to keep it as simple as possible, which makes sense. Wheelin' and Dealin' has this introductory shot of Lifty and Shifty that is completely different from the final, and also Shifty has no nose. How does he smell? These boards are also in a different color and art style, meaning that they likely weren't done by Ken. My guess would be Rody, but it's hard to say for sure. However, I'm leaning towards it being Rhodey more after seeing the boards for Stayin' Alive. That episode shows boards that are most likely done by Rhodey, as the ink is in black instead of Ken's red, and the proportions are nearly identical to his concept art. These boards are definitely a bit more exaggerated than the final, and a lot more rough, considering that the amount of panels is far lower than in other episode storyboards. Chip Off the Old Block is very notable, as it has a completely different ending, and one that is much darker than the final one. In the final, Pop burns the pile of leaves covering Cub by complete accident. However, the boards are much more sinister, with Pop seeing Cub's injuries and purposely burning the evidence with a smile. Understandably, some members of the crew were a bit put off by this ending being so malicious, and so it was changed to be the ending that we have now. It's also interesting to note that this isn't the last time the storyboards were changed due to Pop being overly violent, but we'll get there soon enough. Nuttin' But the Tooth had 3 different endings that were all boarded, but only one was animated, which is the final. The first unused one has Toothy hit the rotten tooth with a golf club, and the other one has Toothy accidentally reading from a car manual and using a jack which rips Nutty apart. Hide and Seek is our first look at Flippy, and another good look at how these boards can be a lot more detailed than the final animation. You may already know that besides a brief moment during his flashback, Flickpy looks no different from Flippy in this episode, but this isn't the case for the boards. As you can see, Flickpy has his distinctive sharp teeth and circular pupils that he later got in the animation, starting in his next appearance. Also, Flaky has ears in these boards, so yeah, that's a thing, I guess. Towards the end of Season 1, Ken's board started to become a lot more stylized, showing us an early version of what would become his current way of drawing the characters, with very circular eyes and pupils as opposed to the oval eyes and pupils that the show has always used. It's pretty interesting how dynamic the boards are compared to the final animation. In some ways, it kinda makes the final look a lot more flat than it actually is. Take this shot from It's a Snap, and how the characters in the boards are drawn at angles that you usually don't see in the final animation. Also, Lumpy has a hat in the boards. It isn't just this panel. The entire episode's boards show him with this hat, and I wasn't sure why it was cut until I considered something. Sometimes the boards have changes that may seem small, but actually have logical reasons for being changed. For example, Giggles in Snow What That's What has mittens in the boards, but she doesn't have any mittens in the final. This was most likely done to save time drawing new assets for every single hand pose, and it's not like mittens are really needed to sell the idea of the episode. Speaking of Giggles, her and Petunia were definitely used very interchangeably in this era, as the boards for This Is Your Knife show Petunia, where the final uses Giggles, probably due to them sharing a voice and Petunia not having her OCD established until the TV series, meaning that they were basically identical characters until then. These same boards depict Flickpy with sharp, pointy teeth, as opposed to the square teeth that he had in this era, and you may realize that Flickpy actually did end up having these sharp teeth in the TV series onwards, and I'll get into why that is when we get there. Another Flippy-related set of boards, and another fairly well-known set of boards, are the ones for Happy Trails Part 2. In the boards, we can see that Flippy was originally supposed to be Pop. You can actually still observe this change in the final episode, as Flippy, who usually has a very high-pitched voice, has Pop's low voice,
What?
played by the same actor, Aubrey Ankrum. Pop was switched to Flippy at the last minute due to it being very off-putting for him to be burying other characters, as well as the fact that when you see Pop, you usually see Cub, and Cub isn't in this episode. This change was definitely for the better. I'm honestly surprised this episode wasn't just written to have Flippy from the start. As for the rest of Season 2, the boards are mainly unchanged in terms of formatting, but there are still plenty of things that I noticed. Eye Candy doesn't have this wacky perspective shot at all in the boards, most likely because it was just really weird to draw. Rink Hijinks again shows Lumpy in a hat that he doesn't have in the final. I also like how over-the-top Lumpy's scream is in the boards compared to the final. Flippin' Burgers is one of the most infamous episodes, as it shows an entire cut scene, showing Flippy using a coat rack to skin Mole before doing a sick flip over the counter. I couldn't find any actual cited reason for why this scene was cut, so my guess would just be time constraints. Just after the scene, we can see Flaky as the cook where Petunia is in the final, as well as Flickpy making this very goofy face. Snip Snip Hooray isn't too notable, except for this scene, which has Cub making this little cat face, which I don't think the show ever did on one of the main characters. Ice Cold Lemonade has boards in a very different, very detailed style compared to Ken's art. And I mean really detailed. If you can believe it, these boards are even more disturbing than the final episode. The inside of the eye also looks more like an actual lemon, as opposed to the grapefruit look used in the final, attributed to nobody at Mondo knowing what the inside of an eye actually looked like, and nobody wanting to find out. I Get a Trick Out of You only features Lumpy in the boards, with all the other characters just being generic base models, showing that they hadn't decided who was going to be in the episode until later in production. Also, the partygoers have hats in the boards, but not in the final. Seriously, what is it with hats being cut from the final animation? The practice of using generic models as stand-ins is common in the storyboards, and one instance I want to talk about is Class Act. Okay, so there's this panning shot that starts on Toothy, shows various characters in pain, just like the final, and then stops the pan on a second Toothy. Oops. Out on a Limb is not too noteworthy in terms of changes, but it is noteworthy to mention that a copy of this page was auctioned off on eBay, signed by writer Ken Pontac for a charity event. You can tell this is a copy due to it being in black and white, where the DVD version is in the red that it should be. The listing states that this was donated by Ken Pontac himself, and I assume he chose this episode as he's gone on record calling it one of his favorites. ICU didn't seem super noteworthy until I noticed Lumpy's hat. Okay, what is it with these hats? Is Lumpy just not allowed to wear hats except for specific scenarios? Or hats just that hard to draw? I really have no idea. Now, I would go into a long 20-minute rant about this subject, but I'm gonna spare you the details and just move on. Despite not being the first appearance of the idol, Hello Dolly has a completely different design for the idol in the boards. It also has this neat shot of Disco Bear, which is appropriately dynamic, considering that in some ways, this episode was basically just a contest between the animators to see who could make the most overly complex movements possible. In that sense, the boards are actually way simpler compared to the final. Sadly, the rest of the pre-TV series doesn't have boards released for every episode. Blind Date was boarded by Ghostbot, who's most well known for making the TV title cards. These boards were later partially released on their website, but besides that, the 5 other internet episodes in Season 2 do not have publicly released boards from what I could find, so I can't really comment on them. So this is where we're gonna have to end this part. Still though, there's so much to observe and enjoy in these boards, and hopefully this video showed you something you didn't know before. I only went through the major changes and things that I found personally interesting myself, so if there's an episode I skipped, or a moment you want to see the boards from, I highly encourage you to look through these boards yourself, as in the case of the pre-TV series, they come bundled with the commentary tracks, which often provide some extra details and history, both about the boards and the show itself. If you like the show, they are a must-watch. And there you have it, part 1 of the Storyboards video. Part 2 will focus on the TV series and everything past that, as the TV series has 39 extra-long episodes boarded by over a dozen different artists, so I'm still trying to think about how I want to format that video to be as informative and easy to follow as possible. However, before I do that, I will be making another history video. I'm leaning towards talking about the show's soundtrack, but I may end up running another poll if I'm not sure. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.